Hey everyone! In this video we're going to be talking about analyzing scientific research. Now it's going to be important for you not just to analyze your own research and your peers' research, but research that is out there published for you to see in the scientific world. It's really important to be able to analyze this research in order to expand your own ideas and to design your own experiments. There is a ton of stuff out there, and it's really important that you develop skills for analyzing the research that is available so you can find the best information to inform your own experiments. So we're going to go through today some different methods for how to do that the best way. Now, the goal of this video is to give you an introduction into analyzing other scientific experiments, especially ones written in journal articles. Now, you're not going to become an expert on this right away, but hopefully this video will give you a short guide on how to analyze experimental design setups for appropriateness of data, data collection methods, validity, accuracy, reliability, and how to suggest refinements when appropriate. This is by no means an exhaustive list to things to do or look for, but it is a start, especially if you're reading and reviewing scientific journal articles and research for the first time. So, where to start? I have other videos on how to find reputable sources on the internet. In some of your other high school classes, you might have learned the 3 big things to look for. So sites with .edu, .gov, or peer-reviewed journals are a great place to start. Another place to start is libraries. Oftentimes there's great databases with peer-reviewed journal articles in them, and of course Google Scholar or other databases you might have access to. If you have a friend or you know someone who's a university student or who works at a university, they may have access to the university library research databases, which are excellent ways to find reputable scientific information. So I encourage you to check out some other videos, which I'll link below, but after a little bit of background and exploration, you should start feeling pretty comfortable about how to dig in to scientific research that is out there. Again, the first step is going to be select articles on the topic in which you're interested. Don't just Google something random like scientific journal articles. You want to be specific in your search terms. Now, you also want to make sure you differentiate between news articles and scientific research. News articles are there to inform the public about what's going on, but they're not the research themselves. When you look for information about experiments and about advancements in your field, you want to make sure you're reading the primary source, not something that's a summary. So you can start somewhere like a news site or Wikipedia if you have to, but make sure you follow the citations back to the original research. So let's say we found a source. We want to make sure it's from a peer-reviewed, reputable journal. There's a lot of journals out there, and there's a lot of things that may look reputable when they are actually not. You want to watch out for pay-to-publish places. Some of these are open source too, so unfortunately, it's kind of makes the research part a little bit murky these days. But there are some great open source journal sites out there as well. So if you're not sure, check out some of the other things that we'll be talking about in this video, but you can always start with some of the more reputable journals, Nature, Science, the big name ones, and then go off to other journals if you need to. One thing you should look for when you get started are the citations and the date of publication. Some research can become outdated, and if the article is citing research that is outdated as well, that could be a problem. Check out the authors of the article or of the research themselves. Are they from reputable universities? Are their credentials listed? Can you look them up? Can you find their university site? Can you find their CVs? Is that author qualified to write about that topic? Are they a professional in that field? Or are they even associated with some important institution? Then you can scroll down to the bottom of the article and look for the citations. Think about who they're citing, and you can apply the same criteria to their citations as you did to them. You don't have to go through every single citation because there's probably a lot of them for good articles. But right here, this is just a screenshot from one journal article I found recently. You can see the CDC is cited here. That's a good source, 2017, a pretty recent date. And then we have other articles from other journal resources that look pretty reputable. So that's a good place to start. Make sure you check for dates as well in the citations. Make sure they're pretty recent. These ones are cited in 2015, which is great. If they were all in the 80s or the 70s, that might be a problem. If all of these individuals were from the same university as the author, that might be a problem. So just make sure you watch out for those things. Now, there's different types of articles that you're going to be looking for. So we already talked about news and journalistic articles. These are going to provide a brief overview of scientific findings for a general audience. And they're useful for getting started, but they're not the type that you need to be looking for when you're analyzing scientific research. There's also descriptions out there about meetings or conferences or papers that will be released. These might provide brief descriptions of some research that's out there, but again, they're tougher to analyze. The three here are the ones you'll probably most likely come across when you're looking through peer-reviewed journal articles. The first ones are going to be experimental comparisons or experimental articles. These are going to be primary literature. And they should talk about the methodology, so how they did that experiment, and of course present data. There will also be reviews, so these can be literature reviews where they pull together information from many different primary sources and draw new conclusions or recognize patterns, or there can be something like a meta-analysis where they take a lot of articles and make huge conclusions or look for trends. And then of course there's things like clinical case studies and clinical trials. The clinical case studies are going to be another source of primary literature, and they can be very important, but they may not meet all of our requirements for reputability or control groups and that kind of thing that we'll talk about a little later on. So it might also be useful to use secondary literature like textbooks to get a little background information in what you're looking for. And it is easier to get started with these things as you're just diving into your research. All right. So now that we get into the article, later on we'll be talking about exactly how to read these articles pretty quickly and to get into a good pattern of reading them, but eventually you should come to the section on the methods. And there'll be different methods described in the article, especially if it is an experimental description, and you want to make sure the authors are describing how and why particular procedures were used, and you want to make sure they go through the methods of the experiment, so what they did. They should be talking about experimental groups, control groups, treatments, and the groups that they actually used to focus on. And you need to think about, was this group appropriate for the test? Did it make sense that they were testing 12-year-olds when the research was actually about, early elementary school learning? It depends on what you're looking for. Think about the tools they used. Were those appropriate? And were there any modifications or problems that the author cited? Then you're going to want to take a little peek into the statistics. You're going to want to look at the figures presented in the scientific paper and make sure they're using appropriate statistical analyses for the experiment. We'll talk more about that soon. In biology especially, we typically go with a p-value of less than 0.05 to describe statistical significance. So, and when a p-value in an experiment is less than 0.05, we say the difference is statistically significant, and we can use that to help either reject a null hypothesis or say that there is some experimental difference in this particular study. A quick way to look for statistical significance as well is to take a peek at error bars in figures presented in the experiment. And if you see huge error bars on the graph, that might be a warning sign that this particular study was not particularly significant. So if those error bars or the samples overlap, the results are not going to be significant and probably shouldn't be considered valid. So we'll get more into statistics a little later on, but you do want to make sure you're looking at these, recognizing things like how big were the groups, how many trials did they run, is this information going to be statistically valid? And finally, make sure you look at the conclusions. Are what they are concluding matching what the data say? So the analysis of the conclusions can come from the abstract first. They should state a really brief background to the experiment in the analysis in the abstract, and then say what they're going to conclude there as well. Make sure that they are including information about all the data presented in the paper, and make sure they're not including any material that just can't be substantiated. So make sure those conclusions are all supported by the results and they're not just throwing out conclusions just because. Alright, so these are a few things to look for when you start to look at other people's experiments, and I want you to think about these when you apply them to your own experiments as well, because they are important, and we want to make sure that we are using sources that are valid, that are accurate, and that are reliable. Thanks!